Imagine jogging in your own childhood neighborhood, only to have a man with a gun tell you that you don't belong. This is exactly what happened when an HOA cop targeted the wrong neighbor. The kind of story I'm about to tell you could have ended with flashing red and blue lights, yellow tape stretched across a quiet street, and a grieving family trying to understand why their son never came home. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't is because one man, calm, trained, and disciplined, kept control when someone else lost it. Kendrick Vale wasn't a stranger to danger. At 29, he'd already spent years in the Special Forces, seen combat, and carried responsibility that would break most men twice his age. But when he flew back to Texas to visit his parents in the suburbs of San Antonio, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was just glad to be home, glad to sit at his mother's kitchen table again, glad to hear his father's laugh bounce off the walls, glad to take a break from the constant vigilance that had been his life for almost a decade. The neighborhood didn't look any different than when he left it. Manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, folks waving politely as they carried groceries inside. It was the kind of place where people moved because they thought it was safe, and on the surface it was. But safety is only as strong as the people who believe they're in charge of it. And in this neighborhood, one man thought he was in charge. Clifford Harlan. Mid-50s, thick around the middle, with a voice that always carried further than it needed to. He wasn't elected, and he wasn't appointed. But somehow Clifford had turned himself into the self-proclaimed watchdog of the Homeowners Association. If someone parked their truck a little too far off the curb, Clifford was the one leaving a note. If kids played basketball past sundown, he was the one telling them to go inside. And lately, Clifford had decided his word needed backup. So he started carrying a gun. Not in a holster under a jacket, not in his home for protection. No, Clifford strapped it on his hip like a badge, as if he'd been sworn into something he never earned. Kendrick had heard his mother mention Clifford during phone calls while he was overseas. At the time, it sounded like small-town gossip. Every neighborhood had that one guy who took things too seriously, right? He didn't give it much thought. He certainly didn't imagine that Clifford Harlan would be the man to test his patience more than combat zones ever had. That evening, after dinner, Kendrick decided to stretch his legs. He pulled on a light jacket, laced up his shoes, and set out for a jog. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a man enjoying a Texas evening, the air still warm, the sky turning deep orange as the sun sank low. He wasn't armed to the teeth. He wasn't moving tactically. He was just jogging, blending into the background of his own childhood neighborhood. But Clifford didn't see it that way. To Clifford, a young black man moving through the streets at dusk didn't look like a neighbor. It looked like a problem. And Clifford didn't wait to ask questions before reaching for his pistol. Meanwhile, Kendrick was lost in thought, listening to the rhythm of his footsteps hitting the pavement. He noticed a few porch lights flicker on. Somewhere a dog barked. He was thinking about calling his buddy from Fort Bragg later that night, just to catch up. And then he saw movement, someone stepping out from between two parked cars up ahead. It was Clifford, hand already near his weapon, eyes locked. "Hey!" Clifford barked, his voice carrying across the street. "What are you doing here?" Kendrick slowed, surprised at the sharpness in the man's tone. He'd grown used to neighbors giving a nod or a wave, but this wasn't friendly. Clifford's hand shifted closer to the grip of his pistol, and Kendrick's instincts sharpened in an instant. Years of training told him this was a man itching for a confrontation. "I live here," Kendrick said, his voice calm, steady, controlled. "Just out for a jog." Clifford shook his head like he didn't believe it. "Don't play games with me. This is a private neighborhood. Who are you, really?" Kendrick stopped running altogether, keeping his hands visible at his sides. His military experience taught him one thing above all else in situations like this: control the pace, control the outcome. He wasn't going to match Clifford's aggression, because that was a road with no brakes. But Clifford didn't back down. He squared his shoulders, lips pressed tight, his whole posture radiating one message. He thought he had power. Kendrick could feel the situation heating, second by second. His parents' house was just 3 streets away, yet at that moment it felt like a battlefield line had been drawn right there on the sidewalk. But this was only the beginning, and the night was about to turn sharper than anyone on that street expected. Clifford's words hung in the air longer than they should have, the silence between them sharper than the crickets chirping in the grass. Kendrick stood there, his chest rising and falling from the jog, eyes steady on the man blocking his path. He could see the glint of metal under the streetlight, the pistol strapped to Clifford's belt, too visible, too ready. "Sir, I told you," Kendrick repeated, his tone low but firm. "I live here." "My parents live on Birchfield Drive. I'm just running." But Clifford wasn't listening. His eyes darted over Kendrick like he was a puzzle that didn't fit, like his very presence was out of order in a place Clifford had decided he controlled. "You don't look like you live here," Clifford shot back. His hand twitched near the weapon, as if the idea of touching it gave him confidence. "Name. Address." Now Kendrick swallowed a breath. This wasn't Afghanistan. This wasn't some checkpoint overseas where giving the wrong answer could cost you everything. This was his own neighborhood in Texas, a place where he should have been safe. And yet, here he was, being treated like a suspect for jogging after dinner. He slowly raised a hand, pointing down the street. 3 blocks that way. Brown brick house with a silver pickup in the driveway. My folks' place." "You can ask them." Clifford sneered, not moving an inch. "That's not how this works." "You think I'm stupid? People like you always got some excuse. But I'm not buying it." Kendrick's jaw tightened, but he forced his shoulders to stay relaxed. Inside, his instincts were firing, calculating every move. He could close the distance in 3 strides if he needed to. He could disarm Clifford before the man even knew what happened. But that wasn't the mission here. The mission was to get home without turning this block into a crime scene. A porch light flicked on across the street. Mrs. Denning, an older neighbor Kendrick remembered from childhood, stepped out with her small terrier tugging at the leash. She froze when she saw Clifford squared up against Kendrick, gun within reach. "Cliff? What's going on?" she called out, her voice shaky. Clifford didn't answer her. His eyes never left Kendrick. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to get home," Kendrick said, raising his voice enough for her to hear. "I grew up here. My parents still live right down the road." Mrs. Denning frowned, recognizing Kendrick now in the light. "Cliff, that's the Vales boy. He's been overseas with the army. Put that thing away." For a second, Kendrick thought the situation might deflate, but Clifford just shifted his stance, clearly annoyed. He didn't like being corrected, especially not in public. "Ma'am, go back inside," Clifford barked. "I've got this under control." "Under control?" She shot back, clutching her terrier to her chest. "You're pointing a gun at a neighbor." The dog yipped, the sound echoing off the houses. Kendrick's pulse ticked faster, not from fear, but from the awareness that more eyes were about to join in. He saw blinds shifting in windows, shadows moving behind curtains. Clifford wanted control, but now the whole street was beginning to watch. Kendrick lowered his voice again, directing it only at Clifford. "You don't want to do this. I'm not a threat. I'm telling you the truth." Clifford's lip curled. "I decide who's a threat around here." Kendrick almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. This man had built a whole world in his head where he was the authority, and right now he was willing to gamble with a gun to keep that illusion alive. "Sir," Kendrick said, choosing each word carefully, "I don't want trouble. But if you point that gun at me, you're making a mistake you won't come back from." Clifford's eyes narrowed. He didn't catch the weight in Kendrick's words. Not the threat, but the warning. Another voice cut in then, sharp and nervous. "Cliff! For God's sake, stop!" It was George Randall, who lived 2 houses down, stepping out onto his porch with his phone in his hand. The glow of the screen showed he was already recording. "I'm calling the cops," George said. "Put the gun down before you ruin your life." Kendrick's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Clifford. The air was heavy now, loaded with more than tension. It was loaded with the knowledge that this was no longer private. Clifford couldn't bluff his way through this without consequences. But Kendrick also knew cornered men were dangerous. The moment pride mixed with fear, logic disappeared. He took one slow step forward, palms still open. His voice softened, almost conversational. "Listen, man. You're worked up. I get it. But you're not law enforcement. You don't have authority here. You're just pointing a gun at a neighbor who's trying to go home. That's all this is. Let's both walk away tonight. That's the smart move." For the first time, Clifford hesitated. His hand hovered, not quite grabbing the pistol but not leaving it either. His eyes darted between Kendrick, George with the phone, and Mrs. Denning clutching her terrier. The audience was growing, and Clifford wasn't used to being challenged this way. But hesitation doesn't mean surrender, and in the next moment, Clifford's pride was about to push the standoff even further. The silence on Birchfield Drive felt alive, like the entire street was holding its breath. Clifford Harlan's hand twitched again near the pistol on his hip, and Kendrick could see the man's chest rising and falling quicker than before. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was ego, pride, the refusal to look weak in front of neighbors who were now staring through their blinds. "Don't take another step!" Clifford barked, his voice cracking at the end. Kendrick froze in place. His military training told him what he was dealing with, a man armed, nervous, and desperate to feel in control. Those were the worst combinations. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the situation would detonate. "I said I live here," Kendrick replied, his tone calm but firmer than before. "My parents are Albert and Lorraine Vale. Ask anyone on this street, they'll tell you." Clifford's face twisted, almost like he couldn't process the fact that people around him might recognize Kendrick. "I don't care what names you throw at me. You don't belong out here this late. You think you can walk around and nobody notices?" "Not on my watch." Kendrick tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Your watch? You mean the HOA?" Clifford stiffened. "That's right. Somebody's got to enforce the rules around here." That answer made Kendrick bite back a bitter laugh. Combat zones had actual rules of engagement. Here, Clifford was writing his own laws with a handgun. From the sidewalk across the street, George Randall's voice cut through again, this time louder. "Cliff, you've lost it! Everyone can see what you're doing! Put the gun away before the police get here!" The words police seemed to ripple through Clifford, but instead of backing down, he hardened. He turned his head slightly toward George without breaking his stance. "Mind your business, George. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, it concerns all of us." George shot back. "You're pointing a loaded gun at a soldier who grew up here. Everyone knows the Vales. Everyone knows you're not a cop." Kendrick stayed still, his eyes locked on Clifford. He knew George's words were true, but they also risked cornering Clifford further. A man like Clifford wasn't going to let himself be humiliated in front of half the neighborhood. That kind of pride was combustible. Mrs. Denning stepped forward too, holding her tiny terrier like a shield. Her voice shook, but it was strong enough. "Cliff, you put that gun down right now. That's Albert and Lorraine's son. He used to mow my lawn in high school, for heaven's sake." For just a second, Clifford's arm dropped an inch, the weight of recognition pressing on him. Kendrick caught the movement, his instincts alert. "See," Kendrick said softly, keeping his voice level. "They know me. I'm not a stranger. I'm not a threat. I'm just going home." Clifford's eyes darted between them, his breathing quickening. His hand lingered close to the grip, indecisive. He wasn't ready to lose face. "You think I'm stupid?" Clifford snarled, spitting the words like they were poison. "People lie all the time. How do I know you're not armed right now?" Kendrick held his gaze, letting the question settle. He thought carefully before answering, his voice steady. "You don't know. That's the problem, isn't it? You're pointing a gun at someone without knowing the facts, and you're about to make a mistake that'll haunt you." The words weren't shouted. They weren't angry. They carried the weight of experience. Experience Clifford couldn't possibly understand. Clifford shifted his feet, trying to look taller. "You don't talk to me like that. You don't give me warnings." At that moment, Kendrick realized Clifford had no control. Not really. The gun wasn't about safety. It was about power, and Clifford was drowning in the need to prove he had it. "You've already lost control," Kendrick said quietly. "Look around you. Half this street is watching. That phone over there is recording. Every second you keep your hand near that gun, you're digging a hole deeper than you can climb out of." For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Clifford's chest heaved, his jaw tight, his fingers flexing. Kendrick's stance remained steady, calm, the exact opposite. It was the difference between training and bluster, between reality and fantasy. Then, like a spark hitting gasoline, Clifford snapped. His hand yanked the pistol free, and the metallic click of it clearing the holster cracked through the night. Gasps echoed from porches and windows. "Drop it, Cliff!" George shouted, his phone shaking in his hand. "You're being recorded!" "Drop it!" Kendrick didn't flinch. His voice cut through the chaos, measured, controlled. "If you point that at me, you're gambling with your life." "You think I'm scared of you? I've stared down worse than this. You've got one chance to walk away." Clifford's eyes burned with something wild, but his grip trembled slightly. That tremor told Kendrick everything he needed to know. This wasn't a man ready for violence, it was a man pretending. But pretenders with guns were the most dangerous kind. Neighbors' voices filled the street now, some begging Clifford to stop, others yelling for police. Kendrick stayed locked in, focused on the man in front of him. "Clifford," he said evenly, "you're not law enforcement. You're not the judge here. You're a neighbor, same as me. And right now, you're about to ruin your life over pride. Is it worth it?" The silence stretched again, unbearable and heavy. Clifford's gun was raised, but his hand shook. Kendrick's heart pounded steady, not from fear, but from the razor-sharp awareness of how thin the line was between life and death on that Texas street. But the gun was out now, and there was no turning back. The confrontation was about to hit its breaking point. The night had gone from quiet to electric in a matter of minutes. Clifford Harlan now held the pistol in his hand, the barrel angled toward Kendrick's chest, trembling just enough for everyone watching to notice. From the porches, neighbors whispered to each other, cell phones pointed at the confrontation. Some filmed, some called 911. Nobody dared step closer. Kendrick stood still, his breathing steady, his hands open at his sides. Years of special forces training had carved discipline into his bones. He knew that one wrong move, even a flinch, could trigger Clifford's panic. And a panicked man with a gun was as dangerous as any enemy on the battlefield. "Don't test me!" Clifford shouted, the words cracking under strain. His face was red now, sweat glistening at his temple. "I said stop where you are!" "I already stopped," Kendrick replied evenly. His voice didn't rise. He didn't mirror the aggression. "You're the one making this worse." Clifford's hand twitched again, the gun bobbing ever so slightly. Kendrick kept his eyes on the man, noting every detail, the uneven stance, the shallow breathing, the way Clifford's trigger finger floated dangerously close. "Cliff, for God's sake, think about what you're doing," George Randall called from across the street. His phone was still raised, recording every second. "You point that thing at him, you're not coming back from it. Everyone here is watching." But Clifford didn't lower the weapon. His pride was bleeding out in front of his neighbors, and he was scrambling to patch it up with force. "Stay out of this, George," Clifford snapped, swinging the barrel dangerously in his direction for half a second before snapping it back toward Kendrick. That moment told Kendrick all he needed to know. Clifford had no trigger discipline. He wasn't in control of the weapon, and that meant the danger had multiplied. Kendrick's voice cut through again, calm but with steel underneath. "You're pointing a loaded gun at a man who hasn't done a thing to you. Think about how this looks. Think about where this ends." Clifford sneered, his voice dripping with false authority. "Where this ends is me protecting my neighborhood." "Protecting?" Kendrick asked. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "From what? A jog? A man walking down the street? Look at yourself. You're the threat here." The words hit Clifford harder than Kendrick expected. His shoulders jerked, his grip tightening, as if the truth was too much to hear. He took a half step closer, the pistol now only a few feet from Kendrick's chest. Gasps rippled through the neighborhood. Mrs. Denning clutched her terrier tighter, shouting, "Cliff, stop it! You're going to kill him!" Kendrick adjusted his stance, imperceptibly subtle, distributing his weight just in case. If Clifford's finger twitched the wrong way, he would have to react. Fast. But reacting meant consequences, and Kendrick was painfully aware of the fine line he was walking. "Sir," Kendrick said, steady as stone, "I've been in situations like this before. And I promise you, if you pull that trigger, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. You don't want that blood on your hands." Clifford's breathing grew louder, ragged, the pistol trembling more visibly now. His eyes darted again to the neighbors watching, to George's phone recording, to the shadows shifting behind windows. For the first time, doubt flickered in his face. "You think you're smarter than me?" Clifford muttered, almost to himself. "You think because you were in the army you can talk down to me?" Kendrick took the opening, his voice soft but cutting. "No. I think because I was in the army, I know how quickly this can turn into something you can't control, and you don't want to learn that lesson the hard way." George shouted again, "Cops are on their way!" "Drop it before they show up, Cliff." The mention of police made Clifford twitch. His hand shook harder now, and Kendrick could almost feel the weight of that fear filling the air. Clifford wasn't afraid of Kendrick. He was afraid of losing face, of being seen as weak. Kendrick lowered his voice again, almost like he was speaking only to Clifford. "You've got a choice right now. You can either put that gun away and walk back inside your house, or you can spend the night in handcuffs. Or worse. That's where this is going." For a moment, Clifford's arm sagged, the gun dipping slightly toward the ground. The neighbors collectively exhaled, just for a second. But then Clifford's eyes hardened again, and he snapped the weapon back up. "Don't tell me what to do!" he roared. His whole body was shaking now, the pistol wobbling in his grip. Kendrick didn't move, didn't blink. His voice was low, sharp, and final. "If you're going to point that thing at me, then you better be ready to use it. Because once it's out, there's no more pretending." The words cut through the chaos, landing heavy on everyone present. Clifford froze, gun trembling, his face pale now under the streetlight. He had crossed a line by drawing it, and everyone knew there was no walking back without consequence. But just as the tension stretched to its breaking point, the sound of sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, and that changed everything. The faint wail of sirens curled through the night air, distant but unmistakable. For some, it was a sound of relief. For Clifford Harlan, it was gasoline on the fire. His eyes widened, darting toward the street corner, then snapping back to Kendrick. The gun wavered in his hand, his breathing louder than ever. "They're coming!" George Randall called, almost triumphant, his phone still fixed on Clifford. "You're finished, Cliff." "Everyone's seen this. Put the gun down before they drag you off in cuffs." Clifford snarled, his face twisting in anger. "Shut your mouth, George. You've always had it out for me." He took another step closer to Kendrick, the pistol trembling inches higher. "Don't you move," he growled, though Kendrick hadn't taken a step since the standoff began. Kendrick could feel the weight of every neighbor's eyes pressing in from all angles. Porch lights flicked on one by one, doors cracked open, whispers carried through the heavy Texas air. The once silent street was now an audience, watching a man unravel in real time. A voice came from across the road. Mr. Alvarez, a retired teacher who had lived there for decades. He stood on his lawn in his slippers, his wife gripping his arm tightly. "Cliff, you've gone too far. That's Albert and Lorraine's boy. He served this country. You're embarrassing yourself in front of the whole block." Clifford whipped his head toward Alvarez for a split second, shouting, "Stay out of this!" The barrel swung dangerously again before returning to Kendrick. That lack of control made Kendrick's instincts tighten. He'd seen nervous men like this overseas, men who thought they had control but were seconds away from disaster. Kendrick's voice sliced through the noise, calm and commanding. "Look at me, Clifford. Right here. Don't look anywhere else. Just me." The command worked, if only because Clifford needed someone to lock onto. His eyes fixed on Kendrick, teeth gritted, the gun still shaking. "Sirens are getting closer," Kendrick said quietly. "You hear that? In less than a minute, cops will be here. And when they see you pointing that gun, do you know what happens?" Clifford swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "They'll understand," he muttered weakly. "I was protecting my neighborhood." "No," Kendrick said, his tone sharp as a blade. "They'll see an armed man threatening a veteran in front of a dozen witnesses. They'll put you on the ground before you can explain a word." Mrs. Denning added her voice, trembling but forceful. "Cliff, please. Think about your wife. Think about your kids. Don't do this to them." Her words cracked through Clifford's stubborn shell for a moment. His hand sagged just slightly, the pistol dipping an inch lower. The sight made the neighbors gasp in unison, as if they were all tethered to the same thread. But pride is a cruel anchor. Clifford straightened his arm again, voice breaking with rage. "Nobody tells me what to do. Not the HOA, not the cops, not anyone." Kendrick's patience thinned, but his discipline never broke. He kept his voice steady, low enough that Clifford had to focus on him. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're standing tall right now, but everyone here is watching you fall apart. You're not the protector, you're the danger." That cut deeper than Kendrick expected. Clifford's jaw clenched, his grip tightening. His entire body shook with the effort of keeping the gun steady. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue, beginning to reflect faintly on the houses at the far end of the street. Neighbors shifted nervously, some stepping back toward their doors, others frozen in place. George called again, louder this time. "Cliff! Last warning. Put it down before they turn this into something worse than you can handle." Clifford's face twisted into something almost desperate. "They'll believe me," he muttered, half to himself. "I'm the one protecting this place. They'll believe me." Kendrick took a careful breath, his voice controlled. "They won't believe you, Clifford. They'll believe the cameras, they'll believe the witnesses, they'll believe the truth. And right now, the truth is you're aiming a gun at a neighbor who hasn't laid a finger on you." For a split second, Kendrick thought the man might actually drop the weapon. His hand trembled so violently it looked like it could slip from his grasp. But the weight of humiliation, the chorus of neighbors shouting, the flashing lights drawing closer, those pressures combined into something volatile. The sound of tires crunching gravel echoed down the street. A squad car swung into the block, lights blazing, sirens cutting out. 2 officers stepped out with weapons already drawn, shouting commands. "Drop the gun!" One of them barked, their voices sharp and rehearsed. "Drop it now!" Every neighbor seemed to stop breathing. The entire street froze in the flashing lights, waiting for the single decision that would decide how the night ended. Kendrick didn't move. His voice, calm and unwavering, filled the air one last time before the police closed the distance. "Clifford, this is it. Put it down. Don't make this worse for yourself." But Clifford's pride wasn't done fighting yet, and in the next moment, the standoff reached its most dangerous point. The squad car's lights painted the entire street in strobes of red and blue, bouncing off windows, washing over every face that had gathered. Clifford stood in the middle of it all, pistol raised, sweat trickling down his cheek, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. The officers had their guns leveled at him now, voices cutting through the chaos. "Drop the weapon! Do it now!" But Clifford didn't move. He looked like a man trapped between 2 realities, the fantasy in his head, where he was the neighborhood's savior, and the hard truth staring him down in the flashing lights. His hand shook violently, but he kept the gun pointed in Kendrick's direction, almost as if lowering it would mean losing everything. Kendrick didn't so much as blink. His focus tunneled in on Clifford's trembling hand, every muscle in his body tuned like wire. Years of training weren't just about combat. They were about controlling yourself when everything screamed chaos. He remembered drills in Fort Bragg, standing in the blistering sun while instructors barked, "Control your breathing, control your mind, control your outcome." In Afghanistan, he'd once stood with his team outside a village hut, tension thick as they negotiated with a man holding a rifle inside. One wrong move, and it would have turned into a bloodbath. That day, Kendrick learned the power of patience. He learned that silence, steady words, and stillness could disarm a situation more effectively than bullets. That lesson hummed in his chest now. Clifford was no trained enemy, no hardened militant. He was an overzealous neighbor with a fragile ego and a gun he barely knew how to handle. And Kendrick refused to let this man dictate the ending of the night. "Clifford," Kendrick said, voice low but deliberate. The officer's commands thundered around him, but he spoke as if it were just the 2 of them. "I want you to hear me. You're not in control anymore. You never were. But you can still walk away from this with your life intact." "Shut up!" Clifford snapped, his gun jerking upward. The officers tensed, fingers curling tighter on their triggers. "Drop it!" one of them shouted again. "Drop the weapon or we'll fire!" Kendrick could feel the seconds slipping away. The wrong movement from anyone, the officers, the neighbors, Clifford himself, could detonate the entire scene. "Listen to me," Kendrick pressed on, his voice calm, slow, steady. "They're not going to hesitate, Clifford. You twitch that trigger, and they'll drop you right here on this street in front of your wife, your kids, your neighbors. That's what's coming if you don't lower it." Clifford's breathing grew ragged, his eyes darting wildly now. The bravado in his face had cracked, replaced by panic. He looked left and right, but no one was with him. Not George, not Mrs. Denning, not Mr. Alvarez. Every voice was against him. Every pair of eyes watched him unravel. "You don't get it," Clifford muttered, almost pleading. "I was just protecting." "You're not protecting anyone," Kendrick cut in sharply, but not unkindly. "You're scaring your neighbors. You're scaring the very people you claim you're protecting. Look at them." Clifford's eyes darted across the crowd. Fearful faces, cameras recording, mouths whispering prayers. The realization sank deeper than bullets ever could. One of the officers barked again. "Final warning! Drop the gun now!" Kendrick's tone softened, just enough to thread through Clifford's panic. "You can still choose. You can lower it. That's the only way this doesn't end with blood on the pavement." A heavy silence clamped down on the street. Clifford's grip wavered, the pistol dipping slightly. Kendrick caught the movement, seized the chance. "You've got kids, right?" he asked, his voice almost conversational. "Do you want them to watch their father die on the sidewalk? Do you want them to see that video online forever? Because that's what's about to happen if you don't let go." Clifford's lip trembled, his face pale under the red-blue strobes. His eyes flickered with something Kendrick recognized from combat zones. Not rage anymore, not defiance. Fear. The raw, naked kind that eats a man from the inside. The pistol sagged another inch. Gasps broke from the neighbors. Officers inched forward, still shouting, but their voices carried less fire now, more command. Kendrick pressed one last time. "You say you're protecting this place? Prove it. Protect them from seeing a man die tonight. Protect your family from losing you. Put the gun down." Clifford's hand shook violently, knuckles white. The weapon dipped again, lower, lower, until finally, it slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the asphalt. The street erupted. Neighbors exhaled in relief, officers surged forward, and Clifford dropped to his knees, his hands flying to his head as police shouted and rushed in. The weight of humiliation crushed him more than the flashing cuffs that bound his wrists. Kendrick stood still, breathing steady, watching the scene close out in slow motion. His discipline had kept him steady. His patience had saved not just his own life, but Clifford's as well. But the story didn't end with Clifford in handcuffs. The aftermath was about to ripple through the neighborhood in ways no one expected. The scrape of metal against pavement when Clifford's pistol hit the ground should have ended it. For a heartbeat, it did. Neighbors clapped hands over their mouths, police surged forward, and Kendrick allowed himself a single measured breath. But Clifford Harlan wasn't finished. Pride rarely goes quietly. As the first officer closed in, barking, "On the ground! Hands behind your head!" Clifford's body jerked like a man waking from a nightmare. He dropped to his knees, but instead of flattening out, he twisted, throwing one shoulder back and snarling, "I'm not some criminal. You don't treat me like this." The officers reacted instantly, one pressing a knee between his shoulder blades, the other reaching for his wrists. Clifford thrashed, red-faced, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Get off me! I was protecting my neighborhood." The crowd flinched at his outburst, but Kendrick didn't move. His training told him what was happening. The danger wasn't the pistol anymore. It was Clifford's desperation. A cornered man could be just as deadly as an armed one. One officer gritted his teeth as Clifford twisted under him. "Stop resisting!" "I'm not resisting!" Clifford roared, though his elbows swung wildly, forcing the officers to wrestle him into control. For a split second, Clifford's eyes locked on Kendrick. The hatred in them wasn't the kind born overnight. It was old, festering, the kind of resentment Clifford had probably carried for years. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, straining against the officer's grip. "You think because you've been in the army, you can humiliate me like this?" Kendrick didn't answer. He just stood tall, his silence louder than words. That silence gnawed at Clifford, fueling his final eruption. "Say something!" Clifford barked, his face beet red, spit flying as he writhed. "You don't belong here. You hear me? You never belonged here." The words cut through the air sharper than the flashing lights ever could. The neighbors heard it. The officers heard it. The whole street stood witness to Clifford's truth laid bare. Kendrick finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, almost soft. "I've bled for this country. I've lost brothers for it. I belong here more than you can understand." The words landed like a hammer. Clifford's body sagged, not out of surrender, but out of something darker, a collapse of his last illusion of power. The officers seized the moment, snapping cuffs around his wrists, forcing him flat against the asphalt. The crowd erupted in noise, some gasping, some shouting, "Enough already!" George called out, "We all saw it, Cliff! The whole world's gonna see it." His phone camera caught every second of Clifford's breakdown. Mrs. Denning shook her head, clutching her terrier, her voice trembling. "Shame on you, Clifford." Shame. But Clifford, face pressed to the pavement, still spat venom. "This is my neighborhood." "Mine. You'll regret this, all of you." His words cracked with desperation, but they had lost their weight. No one believed him anymore. One officer tugged him upright, reading him his rights, while the other secured the pistol into an evidence bag. Clifford's face was streaked with sweat and dirt, but his glare at Kendrick burned through it all. "You'll see," he muttered, almost a whisper now. "You'll see what happens when a man is pushed too far." Kendrick didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't weakness, it was power. It was restraint. It was the difference between Clifford's chaos and his own discipline. As the officers hauled Clifford toward the squad car, neighbors began to spill from their porches. Murmurs rose in waves, shock, anger, disbelief. One man shook his head and muttered, "Never thought it'd come to this." Another woman whispered, "What if Kendrick hadn't been trained? What if he'd panicked?" Kendrick heard those words, and they weighed heavier than Clifford's insults. He knew the truth. If he hadn't stayed calm, the street could have been stained with blood. He exhaled slowly, letting the adrenaline bleed out of his system. His parents' house was just down the road, but it felt miles away. He knew his mother had probably heard the sirens, maybe even watched from the window, terrified her son wouldn't walk back through the door. The officers pushed Clifford into the back seat of the cruiser. He shouted one last time, muffled through the glass, "This isn't over!" The squad car door slammed shut. The lights flashed, the engine growled, and Clifford Harlan's reign as the self-proclaimed cop of the neighborhood ended not with applause, but with a stunned silence that spread across Birchfield Drive. Kendrick glanced at the faces around him, neighbors he'd grown up with, people who once saw him as the kid delivering newspapers, now staring at him with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that he'd handled the situation with calm. Guilt that they'd allowed Clifford to grow into a monster unchecked. But even as Clifford was driven away, the question lingered in every mind on that street. What damage had already been done, and what would come next once the sun rose? The squad car eased down Birchfield Drive, its lights still flashing, though the siren had gone silent. Every neighbor watched in stunned quiet as Clifford Harlan disappeared around the corner, cuffed, sweaty, and shouting muffled words that no one cared to hear. For the first time all night, the street exhaled, though the air was still heavy, as if everyone knew this was only the start of something larger. Two officers remained behind, one of them jotting notes on a clipboard, the other pacing with a flashlight, taking in faces and details. The neighbors huddled in loose knots, Mrs. Denning with her dog still trembling in her arms, George holding his phone like it was proof of survival, Mr. Alvarez speaking in low tones to his wife. Kendrick stood a few feet from where the confrontation had peaked, his breathing finally slowing. He hadn't moved much during the ordeal, but now the adrenaline drained from his body, leaving his muscles heavy. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling sweat cool against his skin. "Sir?" one of the officers said, approaching him cautiously, though not with suspicion. "Are you okay? Did he make any threats before we arrived?" Kendrick shook his head slowly. "Just what you saw. He came at me while I was jogging. demanded to know what I was doing in my own neighborhood. Drew on me. His voice was even, but there was no mistaking the weight in it. The officer nodded, scribbling quickly. Neighbors back up your story. Whole thing's on video, too. He glanced toward George, who raised the phone in confirmation. We'll need a copy of that for evidence. George stepped forward, his voice tight with anger. You can have it. Everyone needs to see what he did. Clifford's been running around this neighborhood like he's sheriff for years. Tonight, he went too far. Mrs. Denning spoke next, her voice shaking but resolute. We let it happen. We all saw how he acted, the notes he left, the way he treated kids. We laughed it off, told ourselves he was harmless. But tonight, she trailed off, her eyes meeting Kendrick's. Tonight we could have lost you. Kendrick didn't say anything. He just held her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement. He wasn't looking for thanks. He didn't want pity either. All he wanted was the truth to be clear. What had almost happened wasn't an accident. It was a consequence of pride mixed with entitlement and a loaded gun. The officer flipped his notepad shut. We'll file charges, brandishing, assault with a deadly weapon, resisting arrest. The DA will sort out the rest. But for tonight, he's off the street. Good, Mr. Alvarez muttered. His wife clung to his arm, whispering something about how she'd never let their grandchildren walk alone down Birchfield again. Kendrick finally spoke up, his tone low but firm. You all need to think about something. Clifford didn't get like this overnight. He was allowed to play cop. You gave him that leash. He didn't just wake up tonight and decide to point a gun at someone. He grew into it because no one stopped him sooner. The street went silent again. No one argued. They all knew he was right. From the far end of the street, headlights appeared. His parents' pickup truck. The brakes squealed as Albert Vale swung it into the curb. Lorraine stepped out before the truck fully stopped, her hands clutching at her chest. Kendrick, she cried, rushing toward him. She grabbed his arm, scanning him from head to toe as though expecting to find a wound. Are you all right? I heard the sirens, then the neighbors started calling. I thought... Her voice cracked, and she buried her face against his shoulder. I'm fine, Mom, Kendrick said softly, wrapping an arm around her. I'm fine. Albert joined them, his face tight, jaw clenched. He looked at the officers, then at the crowd, then finally at his son. What happened? Clifford happened, George answered bitterly. He pulled a gun on your boy. Whole neighborhood saw it. Whole thing's on video. Albert's fists balled at his sides, his voice low and dangerous. That fool! He stopped himself, shaking his head. He could have killed my son. Lorraine tightened her grip on Kendrick, whispering, Thank God you kept your head. Kendrick gave a small nod. That's the only reason I'm standing here. The crowd lingered longer than they needed to, buzzing in low conversations, replaying what they'd seen. Every glance at Kendrick carried both gratitude and shame. Gratitude that he had diffused what should have been a tragedy. Shame that it was ever allowed to reach that point. The officers finally dispersed, assuring everyone they'd patrol the neighborhood more closely for the next few days. As the squad car rolled off, silence settled back over Birchfield Drive. But it wasn't the comfortable quiet of a safe neighborhood. It was a heavy quiet, one that forced everyone to reckon with what they'd witnessed. Kendrick turned to his parents, guiding his mother gently back toward their house. His father walked on the other side, silent but bristling with anger. Behind them, neighbors whispered into the night, their voices carrying words like humiliation, danger, lucky, shame. But as the Vale's front door closed, Kendrick knew this wasn't over. The true test would come the next day, when the neighborhood had to face itself in the light of morning. Morning came to Birchfield Drive with sunlight bouncing off car windshields and sprinklers hissing across manicured lawns, but it didn't wash away what had happened the night before. If anything, daylight made it harder to ignore. Every neighbor who had stood on their porch watching Clifford unravel now had to live with the memory, and with each other. By 8 o'clock, the street was alive with quiet conversations. Couples leaned close at mailboxes. Retirers walked their dogs slower than usual, pausing when they reached the patch of asphalt where Clifford's pistol had clattered to the ground. Some avoided eye contact, others whispered openly. At the Vale home, Kendrick sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee while his mother hovered near the stove. She had barely slept, replaying the scene in her mind again and again. His father paced near the window, peeking out at every movement on the street. "They're all talking about it," Albert muttered, his voice edged with anger. "I saw Gerald and his wife whispering by the corner. Saw the Denning woman out there too, like they can't believe it really happened. But they all knew Cliff was a problem. They let him run wild for years." Lorraine glanced over, her expression tired. "I just thank God our boy's alive. That's all that matters to me." Kendrick set the mug down and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not just about me, Mom. It's about this place. Everyone let Clifford play cop. Nobody stopped him until he was pointing a gun at me. That's the part you can't ignore." The doorbell rang. Albert went to answer it, and there stood George Randall, phone in hand, eyes weary but sharp. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" he asked. Albert stepped aside. "Come on." George set the phone on the table, unlocking the screen. "I've got the footage copied and backed up. Police already have their copy. But I wanted you to see it, Kendrick." The video played, the shaky frame capturing Clifford pacing, shouting, weapon drawn. Kendrick watched himself on screen, calm and still, hands open, voice steady. He barely recognized himself in that moment. Watching it felt surreal, like he was seeing a version of himself in someone else's story. George's voice was tight. "This thing's already moving online. A couple neighbors shared it in private groups, and you know how that goes. Won't be long before it spreads wider. People are going to have opinions." Albert frowned. "Opinions? There's nothing to debate." Cliff pointed a loaded gun at my son. George nodded. "I know, but you've lived here long enough to know how it works. Some folks will say Cliff snapped. Others will call it self-defense. And some will twist it into something uglier." Lorraine's hands tightened around the dish towel she held. "Ugly? How much uglier can it get?" George hesitated. "I overheard Marla Simmons this morning. She was telling people Kendrick must have provoked him. Said no one just pulls a gun out of nowhere." Albert slammed a fist against the counter, rattling the mugs. "Provoked? My son was jogging. That woman's out of her mind." Kendrick raised a hand, steadying the room. "Let them talk. People will believe what they want. The truth doesn't change." George leaned forward. "Still, you should know. The HOA's having an emergency meeting tonight. Word is some folks want to distance themselves, make it sound like Clifford was acting alone, nothing to do with them. Others are furious, saying they warned about him for years. It's already tearing people apart." Kendrick let out a long breath. "That's what happens when you ignore a problem until it explodes." Everyone's scrambling to pick a side after the fact. George gave a grim nod, then glanced toward the window. "Anyway, I'll let you be. Just wanted you to see the video." "And Kendrick? You handled yourself better than most of us could have. If you hadn't kept your cool, we'd be talking about funerals today." When George left, silence filled the kitchen again. Lorraine touched Kendrick's hand. "You're strong, son. But this isn't fair. You shouldn't have had to face that here. In your own neighborhood." Kendrick squeezed her hand gently. "Life's not fair, Mom. But it's what we do with the unfair moments that matters." Across the street, Mrs. Denning walked her terrier, pausing when she spotted Kendrick through the window. She waved, but the gesture carried more apology than friendliness. A group of teenagers rode past on bikes, slowing near the corner, staring at the spot where the confrontation happened. One muttered, "That's where it went down." The entire neighborhood was changed, even if the lawns looked the same. Clifford might be sitting in a cell, but his shadow lingered on Birchfield Drive. That evening, as the sun dipped and porch lights flicked on, cars began lining the street near the community center. The HOA meeting was underway. Neighbors filed in, voices hushed, glances sharp. Inside, tempers flared quickly. One man shouted, "We told you Clifford was a problem!" Another fired back, "Don't act like you weren't laughing at his little patrols last year." The room crackled with blame and denial. Meanwhile, Kendrick sat at the back, arms folded, letting them argue. He wasn't there to defend Clifford or to shame the neighbors. He was there to listen, to see if anyone would admit the truth, that this could have been avoided if someone, anyone, had spoken up sooner. But as voices rose and accusations flew, Kendrick realized the community wasn't just dealing with Clifford's actions. They were wrestling with their own silence. The HOA meeting stretched late into the evening. Voices clashed like storm waves, some neighbors red-faced with anger, others quiet with shame. The community that once prided itself on order and safety now sat fractured, forced to confront the truth in the harsh, fluorescent glow of the community center. At the back of the room, Kendrick remained still, watching, listening. His arms were folded loosely, his posture calm, but his eyes tracked every word, every accusation. To him, this wasn't about Clifford anymore. Clifford had made his choices. The real story now was about the neighborhood itself, their willingness to ignore warning signs, their silence when it mattered most. Mrs. Denning stood up first, her terrier tucked under her arm. We all knew Clifford was too much. We all rolled our eyes, we all whispered about him, but we never did anything. That's on us. A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in a pressed polo shirt shot back, "Don't dump this on everyone." He acted alone. Nobody told him to pull a gun. "That's not the point," Mr. Alvarez countered, his voice rough. "The point is we let him believe he had authority. We laughed at his patrols, treated him like some comic relief, but we also let him keep doing it. We fed his ego. And now look." Silence followed, heavier than before. Kendrick leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. The words echoed exactly what he had been thinking all day. Clifford didn't create the problem alone. He'd been enabled, allowed, unchecked. Finally, the head of the HOA, a nervous woman named Janet Morse, tapped her pen against the table. "The truth is this neighborhood has to face itself. Clifford's gone, but the culture that let him act like that isn't. We need to decide what kind of community we're going to be moving forward." All eyes turned toward Kendrick then. He hadn't asked to speak, but the weight in the room demanded it. He rose slowly, the scrape of the chair legs loud in the quiet. His gaze moved from face to face, people he'd known since childhood, people who now looked at him with guilt, apology, even admiration. "I didn't come here tonight to argue," Kendrick began, his voice low but steady. "But I'll say this. Last night could have ended with blood on the street. It could have ended with me dead, or Clifford dead, or one of those officers dead. And it almost did, because nobody wanted to deal with a man who got too much power in his own head." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "I spent years in places where life and death came down to seconds, and I learned something. Restraint is strength. Discipline is strength. Clifford had neither. He thought carrying a gun made him powerful, but power without control is just danger waiting to happen." The room was silent. No one shifted now, no one argued. Kendrick's voice softened. "You all have to ask yourselves, what did you ignore? What did you excuse? Because silence isn't neutral. Silence builds men like Clifford. And next time, you might not be so lucky that the person he points a gun at knows how to keep calm." Lorraine sat near the back, her eyes glistening. Albert had his arms crossed, proud but weary. The neighbors stared at Kendrick, some nodding slowly, others lowering their heads. Mrs. Denning whispered, almost to herself, "He's right." Kendrick glanced around one last time before stepping back. "That's all I've got to say." The meeting carried on, but the tone had shifted. Less shouting, more reflection, less blame, more acceptance. Kendrick left before it ended, stepping into the cool night air. The street was quiet again, but it felt different now. He walked home slowly, the weight of the night still heavy, though his stride was steady. Back at his parents' house, Lorraine met him at the door, wrapping him in her arms. "You said what needed to be said," she whispered. "Let's hope they heard it," Kendrick replied. He sat on the porch for a while after, watching the same street where hours earlier Clifford had nearly detonated his pride into violence. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fought for safety in faraway places, only to face danger in the neighborhood he grew up in. But he also knew the lesson mattered here more than anywhere else. Some dangers don't come from the outside. They grow quietly, in plain sight, when good people look the other way. And sometimes the bravest act isn't charging forward. It's standing still, steady, and refusing to let chaos pull you under. Kendrick thought about Clifford's words. The venom of, "You don't belong here." He shook his head. Belonging wasn't about who shouted the loudest or carried the biggest gun. Belonging was about what you stood for when the moment demanded it. As the night deepened, he rose from the porch, stepped inside, and closed the door. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would still have its cracks. But maybe, just maybe, they'd start filling them in. And as for the lesson, it was simple enough. Never confuse pride with power, and never mistake silence for safety. If you've stayed with me through this story, take a moment to think about your own community. What signs do you ignore? What voices do you let go unchecked? Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival is whether someone has the courage to act or the discipline to stay calm. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe and share it. Stories like these matter, and the lessons they carry are worth remembering.